In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a scream pierces the autumn mist. Clara Henshaw, the sharp-tongued queen of the sewing circle, lies dead, her own silver scissors plunged into her heart. Was it a thief in the night, or something far darker? Miss Jane Marple, with her quiet knitting and sharper mind, unravels a web of secrets, a cloaked figure in the lane, a locket hiding a widow's shame, and a fortune that sparked envy. As whispers of betrayal and old wounds surface, the sewing circle's genteel façade crumbles, each woman a suspect, each stitch a clue. But when the truth emerges, a desperate act, born of a taunted past, will it mend the village's peace, or tear it apart forever? Chapter 1. Asterisk. The village of St. Mary, Mead. The village of St. Mary Mead lay nestled in a fold of the English countryside. Its cottages and hedgerows bathed in the soft light of a late September morning. The air carried the first crisp bite of autumn, stirring the leaves of the ancient yews that guarded the churchyard and whispering through the rose bushes that climbed the stone walls of Miss Jane Marple's modest home. Her garden, a patchwork of dahlias and chrysanthemums, glowed with the last defiant colours of summer, and it was here, amid the orderly chaos of nature, that Miss Marple sat, her knitting needles moving with the quiet rhythm of a metronome. The click of the needles was a counterpoint to the distant chime of the church clock, striking 11, and the occasional trill of a blackbird perched in the apple tree. Miss Marple, with her white hair neatly coiled and her pale blue eyes sharp, behind her spectacles, appeared to the casual observer as nothing more than a gentle spinster, one of the many who populated villages like St. Mary Mead. Her tweed skirt and soft cardigan, darned at the elbows, spoke of frugality and habit, and her hands, though delicate, bore the faint calluses of years spent tending her garden and her knitting. Yet those who knew her, and there were few who truly did understood that beneath her unassuming exterior lay a mind as keen as the edge of a well-honed blade, capable of slicing through the tangled threads of human behavior to reveal the truth. Beneath, on this particular morning, Miss Marple's attention was divided between her knitting a complex pattern of cables destined to become a scarf for her nephew, Raymond, and the faint hum of activity in the village. Beyond her gate, St. Mary Mead was a place where life moved at a leisurely pace, its rhythms dictated by the seasons, the church calendar, and the gentle ebb and flow of gossip. Yet today, there was an undercurrent of unease, a ripple in the placid surface of village life that Miss Marple sensed as surely as a fisherman feels the tug of a fish on his line. She had not yet identified its source, but her instincts, honed by years of quiet observation, told her that something was amiss. Her musings were interrupted by the creak of the garden gate and the brisk approach of Mrs. Price, her nearest neighbour, and the village's most enthusiastic purveyor of news. Mrs. Price was a stout woman in her late 50s, with a round face framed by curls that had once been auburn but were now streaked with grey. Her eyes, bright with the fervour of a tale yet untold, gleamed as she hurried up the path, her basket swinging on her arm. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she called, her voice carrying the urgency of someone who could scarcely wait to unburden herself. "Oh, my dear, have you heard? The most dreadful thing has happened." Miss Marple set her knitting in her lap and adjusted her spectacles, her expression one of polite interest. "Good morning, Mrs. Price. Do sit down and tell me what's troubling you. Is it the vicar's sermon again? I heard he was rather long." "Last Sunday," Mrs. Price waved a dismissive hand, settling onto the rotund bench beside Miss Marple with a huff. "Oh, it's nothing to do with the vicar, though heaven knows he could do with a shorter text. No, It's far worse than that. It's Mrs. Henshaw, Clara Henshaw, you know, from Rose Cottage. She's been found dead, and they're saying it's murder." Miss Marple's needles paused, though her face betrayed no surprise. She had learned long ago that shock, like sentiment, clouded the mind, and she preferred to keep her thoughts. "Clear murder," she said softly, her tone inviting further detail. "That is indeed dreadful. Tell me, what do they say happened?" Mrs. Price leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Though there was no one within earshot save a curious sparrow. "It was yesterday evening, or so they think. She was found in her parlor, just sitting there in her armchair, with a pair of sewing scissors, her own, mind you, stuck right in her chest. Poor Mrs. Bantry was the one who found her, went to call on her about the church fete and nearly fainted on the spot. The police are there now, and Inspector Craddock's been called in from Much Benham. They say it's a clear case of murder. No mistake about it." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression remained serene. "Scissors," she murmured, as if the word itself held a clue. "How very curious. And no one saw anything unusual, I suppose?" "Not a soul, or so they say," Mrs. Price replied, her hands fluttering in agitation. "But you know how it is in the village. Everyone's got their eyes on everyone else, yet no one sees a thing when it matters. The sewing circle was at the vicarage last night, and Clara was there, all high and mighty as usual, lording it over the others. They say she left at 9, same as always, and went home alone. But someone must have been there, mustn't they, to do such a thing?" Miss Marple nodded, her mind already turning over the possibilities. The sewing circle was a fixture of St. Mary Mead, a group of women who gathered weekly under the guise of charity, work-stitching quilts for the poor, mending vestments for the church, but who were, in truth, as much a social institution as the Women's Institute. Clara Henshaw had been its unofficial leader, a woman whose forceful personality and sharp tongue had made her both respected and feared. Miss Marple, though not a member, knew its dynamics well, for the village was a small canvas, and every brushstroke of human interaction left its mark. Clara Henshaw was not a woman without enemies, Miss Marple said, almost to herself. She had a way of stirring people up, didn't she? Mrs. Price nodded vigorously. Oh, she did. Always had to have the last word, that one. Why, only last week she had a set-to with Mrs. Greaves at the post office. Something about a land deal gone sour. And Miss Trotter, poor thing, was near tears at the last circle meeting because Clara called her stitching slovenly. Slovenly. Can you imagine? And then there's Mrs. Dunn, who's never forgiven Clara for that business with her brother years ago. It's a wonder they all sat in the same room without coming to blows. Miss Marple's lips twitched in what might have been a smile, though her eyes remained thoughtful. People do manage to sit together, even when they dislike one another, she said. It's one of the curious things about village life. But tell me, who else was at the sewing circle last night? I don't suppose you've heard. Mrs. Price, delighted to be the bearer of such details, ticked them off on her fingers. Well, there was Mrs. Greaves, of course Violet Greaves, with her airs and graces, though everyone knows she's not as rich as she pretends. Then Miss Trotter, Eliza, who's always clutching her prayer book like it's a lifeline. Mrs. Dunn, Margaret, you know, with that sharp tongue of hers. Miss Finch, Laura, the young one who's always talking about going to London to make something of herself. And Mrs. Lane, Beatrice, who's quiet as a mouse but sweet as anything. That's the lot of them, I think. Oh, and Clara, of course, before she, well, you know. Miss Marple nodded, committing the names to memory, though she hardly needed to. She knew each woman in her own way, had observed them at church bazaars and village fetes, had noted their habits and their quarrels. Violet Greaves, with her carefully maintained façade of wealth, had a temper that flared when her pride was pricked. Eliza Trotter, timid and devout, seemed incapable of harming a fly, yet Miss Marple knew that even the meek could be driven to desperation. Margaret Dunn's resentment was an open secret, her spinsterhood a wound Clara had never hesitated to prod. Laura Finch, young and restless, had ambitions that clashed with Clara's domineering nature, and Beatrice Lane, gentle and reserved, carried a quiet sorrow that Miss Marple had often wondered about. It's a terrible business, Mrs. Price went on, shaking her head. The whole village is talking, and no one knows what to think. Inspector Craddock's been asking questions, but he's young, isn't he? Not like old Inspector Slack, who'd have had half the village in cuffs by now. Do you think he'll get to the bottom of it, Miss Marple? Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, a steady click that seemed to underscore her thoughts. Inspector Craddock is a capable young man, she said diplomatically, but murder is a complex thing. It's not just about finding the person who held the weapon, it's about understanding why they did it, and that, Mrs. Price, requires a certain perspective. Mrs. Price looked at her curiously, as if sensing the weight behind her words, but she did not press. Instead, she rose, smoothing her skirt. Well, I must be off. I've got to get to the butcher before he runs out of chops. But you'll keep your ear to the ground, won't you, Miss Marple? You always seem to know what's what. Miss Marple smiled, a small, enigmatic curve of her lips. I shall certainly keep my eyes open, Mrs. Price. Thank you for telling me. It's always best to be informed. As Mrs. Price bustled away, her basket swinging, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, though her mind was far from the scarf in her lap. Murder in St. Mary Mead was not a common occurrence, but it was not unknown. She had seen it before, passions that simmered beneath the surface of village life, erupting in sudden, violent acts. Clara Henshaw's death was no random tragedy. The use of her own scissors suggested intimacy, a personal grievance that had turned deadly. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to her youth, to a parlor maid named Emily who had once taken a pair of shears to her mistress's best lace out of spite. The act had been petty, but the impulse behind it was not so different from what might drive a person to murder. She rose, setting her knitting in the basket by her chair, and crossed the garden to her cottage. Inside, the sitting room was a haven of quiet order, chintz curtains, a polished mahogany table, and a bookshelf filled with well-worn volumes of Dickens and Trollope. On the mantelpiece stood a photograph of her nephew Raymond, now a successful writer in London, and beside it a small vase of late roses. Miss Marple paused, her gaze lingering on the roses, their petals beginning to curl at the edges. Everything has its season, she murmured, and then, with a slight shake of her head, she moved to the window where she could see the lane leading to the village green dot. St. Mary Mead was stirring now, its daily routines resuming despite the shadow of Clara's death. The postman cycled past, his bag bulging with letters. Mrs. Bantry, still shaken from her discovery, could be seen in her garden, speaking animatedly to a neighbour. And beyond toward Rose Cottage, Miss Marple glimpsed the dark shape of a police car, its presence a stark reminder of the violence that had intruded upon their peace. She turned from the window and took up her hat, a sensible felt affair with a single feather. There was work to be done, though not the sort that Inspector Craddock might recognize. He would be busy with fingerprints and alibis, with the mechanics of investigation. But Miss Marple knew that the truth of a murder lay not in the physical evidence alone, but in the hearts and minds of those involved. She would begin, as she always did, by listening to the village, to its whispers and its silences, to the stories it told in glances and half-spoken words. Her first stop would be the vicarage, where the sewing circle met. The vicar, Reverend Clements, was a kindly man, prone to absent-mindedness, but observant in his own way. He might have noticed something amiss at the last meeting, some tension or remark that had passed unheeded. And then there were the women themselves, each with her own secrets, her own reasons to resent Clara Henshaw. Miss Marple would need to tread carefully, for suspicion, once roused, could close mouths as surely as it opened them. As she stepped into the lane, her umbrella tucked under her arm, Miss Marple felt a familiar stirring, a quiet excitement that came not from the thrill of danger, but from the challenge of unraveling a puzzle. Clara Henshaw's death was a knot tightly tied, but every knot had a loose end, if one knew where to look. And Miss Marple, with her unerring eye for the small, the overlooked, the human, was determined to find it. The lane was quiet, save for the crunch of gravel under her sensible shoes and the distant bark of a dog. As she passed the church, its spire rising against the pale sky, she thought of the sewing circle, of the women who sat in its circle, their needles flashing like tiny swords. Clara had been their leader, but leadership, Miss Marple knew, often bred resentment. Had one of them harbored a grudge deep enough to kill? Or was there another player, someone outside the circle, whose motives lay hidden in the shadows? She recalled a conversation with her friend Dolly Bantry, who had once remarked that St. Mary Mead was like a stage, its inhabitants actors playing their parts. But murder, Miss Marple thought, was no mere performance. It was real, raw, a tearing of the fabric that held the village together. And yet, like any tear, it could be mended, if one had the skill to weave the threads back into place. By the time she reached the vicarage, the sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows across the lawn. The vicarage was a rambling old house, its walls covered in ivy, its windows glinting like eyes. Miss Marple knocked, and the door was opened by Mrs. Clements, the vicar's wife, a woman whose cheerful efficiency masked a shrewd understanding of village affairs. "Why, Miss Marple," Mrs. Clements exclaimed, her face lighting up. "What a pleasure to see you. Though I suppose you've heard about poor Clara. Isn't it dreadful?" "Quite dreadful," Miss Marple agreed, stepping into the hall. "I thought I might bring some wool for the sewing circle's next meeting. It's such a worthy cause, and I have some odds and ends that might be useful." Mrs. Clements beamed, though her eyes were shadowed with worry. "That's so kind of you. They'll be meeting tomorrow, though I don't know how they'll manage after. Well, you know, would you like to come in for a cup of tea?" "The vicar's in his study, but I'm sure he'd be glad to see you." Miss Marple accepted, her mind already at work. Tea at the vicarage would be an opportunity to listen, to observe, to gather the first threads of the mystery that was Clara Henshaw. Murder. As she followed Mrs. Clements into the cozy sitting room, she felt the familiar pull of curiosity, the sense that she was stepping into a story whose ending was yet unwritten. The room was warm, with a fire crackling in the grate and the scent of lavender polish in the air. Mrs. Clements bustled about, setting out cups and a plate of scones, while Miss Marple settled into an armchair, her eyes taking in every detail: the worn rug, the framed sampler on the wall, the faint scent of beeswax that clung to the furniture. It was a room that spoke of continuity, of lives lived quietly and well. Yet somewhere, not far from this peaceful haven, a woman had died violently, her life snuffed out by a hand that wielded her own scissors as Mrs. Clements poured the tea. Miss Marple began to ask her gentle, probing questions, drawing out the details of the sewing circle's last meeting. She listened, nodding, her mind sifting through the words like a seamstress sorting threads. Clara had been her usual self. Mrs. Clements said domineering, critical, but no more so than usual. The others had seemed tense, perhaps, but that was nothing new. Miss Marple noted the names again: Violet, Eliza, Margaret, Laura, Beatrice. Each a thread, each a potential clue by the time she left the vicarage. The sun was dipping toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Miss Marple walked slowly, her umbrella tapping the ground, her thoughts weaving a pattern as intricate as the scarf she had left unfinished. Clara Henshaw's death was no accident, no sudden act of madness. It was deliberate, personal, the culmination of something that had festered in the heart of St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple, with her quiet ways and her sharp eyes, was determined to uncover it, stitch by stitch, until the truth lay bare. Chapter 2, Asterisk. The sewing circle. The vicarage of St. Mary Mead stood at the end of a winding lane, its grey stone walls softened by ivy and its leaded windows catching the pale light of an autumn afternoon. The house, with its sagging gables and uneven chimneys, seemed to belong to an older, gentler England, one untouched by the clamour of the modern world. Yet within its walls, on this particular Wednesday, the air was thick with tension, as if the very beams sensed the shadow cast by Clara Henshaw's death. Miss Jane Marple, her basket of wool tucked under her arm, approached the vicarage with the unhurried step of one accustomed to blending into the background, her eyes as sharp as the needle she carried. The sewing circle had gathered as usual. In the vicarage's long, low-ceilinged drawing room, a space that smelled faintly of beeswax and old books. The room was furnished with a mismatched collection of chairs, a faded chintz sofa, and a sturdy oak table where the women worked. A fire crackled in the grate, casting flickering shadows across the walls, where a few sombre portraits had passed. Vicars hung, their eyes seeming to follow the proceedings with disapproval. The women of the sewing circle sat in a loose semicircle, their needles glinting as they stitched at a quilt destined for the church's Christmas bazaar. But the rhythm of their work was uneven, the conversation stilted, and the weight of Clara's absence hung over them like a storm cloud. Miss Marple knocked softly and was admitted by Mrs. Clements, whose usual cheer was tempered by a nervous smile. "Oh, Miss Marple, how kind of you to come," she said, taking the basket. "The ladies will be so pleased to have your wool. It's been, well, a difficult day, hasn't it?" "Indeed it has," Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle but her eyes taking in every detail of the room as she stepped inside. "I thought a bit of wool might be useful, and I confess I was curious to see how the circle is managing. Such a shock, poor Mrs. Henshaw." Mrs. Clements nodded, her hands twisting in her apron. "It's dreadful, simply dreadful. They're all a bit out of sorts, but they insisted on meeting. It's what Clara would have wanted, they said, though I'm not so sure. Come, let me introduce you." The women looked up as Miss Marple entered, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, wariness, and fatigue. There were 5 of them, each distinct in manner and appearance, yet bound by the shared ritual of their craft. Miss Marple knew them all, of course, but she observed them now with fresh interest, noting the small signs that betrayed their thoughts: a tightened lip, a trembling hand, a glance that lingered too long. Mrs. Violet Greaves sat nearest the fire, her posture rigid, her dark hair swept into an elegant chignon that belied the rumors of her financial straits. Her needle moved with precision, but her eyes were cold, darting occasionally to the others as if measuring their worth. She had always carried herself with an air of superiority. Her wealth, or the illusion of it, setting her apart from the village's humbler residents. Clara, Miss Marple recalled, had never hesitated to challenge that pride, her sharp comments cutting through Violet's carefully constructed façade. Beside her sat Miss Eliza Trotter, a small, bird-like woman in her 60s, her grey curls tucked beneath a plain bonnet. Her hands trembled as she stitched, and her lips moved silently, as if in prayer. Eliza was known for her piety, her days spent in service to the church and her evenings poring over her worn Bible. Clara's criticisms of her work, and more cruelly, her faith, had often left Eliza flushed and silent, though she never retorted. Miss Marple noted the way Eliza's eyes flicked nervously toward the empty chair where Clara had once sat, as if expecting her ghost to appear. Mrs. Margaret Dunn, sharp-featured and thin-lipped, worked with a vigor that seemed almost angry, her needle stabbing the fabric as if it were an enemy. Her spinsterhood, a subject of village gossip, had been a favorite target of Clara's barbs, particularly since Margaret's brief engagement to Clara's brother had ended in humiliation. Decades ago, Margaret's eyes, dark and resentful, met Miss Marple's briefly before returning to her work, her silence more eloquent than any words. Miss Laura Finch, the youngest of the group at 25, sat slightly apart, her auburn hair catching the firelight. She was pretty in a determined way, her jaw set and her green eyes bright with ambition. Laura had dreams of a career in London, perhaps as a designer or an actress, and Clara had taken her under her wing, though their relationship had soured in recent months. Laura's stitches were quick but careless, her mind clearly elsewhere, and Miss Marple wondered what secrets lay behind her restless energy. Finally, there was Mrs. Beatrice Lane, a quiet woman in her 40s, her soft brown hair streaked with grey and her hands gentle as they worked. Beatrice was a widow, her husband a soldier who had died in the war, and she carried her grief with a quiet dignity that endeared her to the village. Yet there was something in her demeanour today, a distraction, a faint tremor in her fingers that caught Miss Marple's attention. Beatrice's locket, a small silver oval she always wore, gleamed at her throat, and Miss Marple noted the way her hand strayed to it, as if seeking comfort. Mrs. Clements introduced Miss Marple, who took a seat near the table, her basket at her feet. "I've brought some wool for your quilts," she said, her tone light. "It's not much, but I thought it might do for the borders. I do admire the work you all do here." The women murmured their thanks, though their responses were muted. Violet spoke first, her voice cool. "It's kind of you, Miss Marple, though I'm not sure we'll get much done today. We're all rather shaken, as you can imagine." "Quite understandable," Miss Marple said, her eyes moving from one face to another. "Such a tragedy. I suppose you were all here last night, weren't you? Before it happened." A silence fell, heavy and uncomfortable. Eliza's needle slipped, pricking her finger, and she gasped softly, sucking at the tiny bead of blood. Margaret's lips tightened, and Laura's cheeks flushed. Beatrice looked down at her work, her fingers still. Violet, however, met Miss Marple's gaze with a faint smile. "We were here until 9, she said. Clara left first, as she always did. She liked to be home by dark. The rest of us stayed a bit longer, tidying up. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle sympathy. Of course. And no one saw anything unusual, I suppose. It's so hard to imagine such a thing happening in St. Mary Mead. No one saw a thing, Margaret said sharply, her voice cutting through the room. We were all here, stitching and talking, same as always. Clara was, well, Clara, bossing everyone about, telling us how to do our work. If anyone had a mind to kill her, they didn't show it here. Margaret, Eliza's voice was a whisper, her eyes wide with shock. You shouldn't speak so. It's not Christian, Margaret snorted, her needle stabbing the fabric again. Christian or not, it's the truth. Clara had a way of getting under people's skin. You know that as well as I do, Eliza. Laura shifted in her seat, her voice low but firm. She wasn't always kind, but she didn't deserve that. No one deserves that. Beatrice said nothing, her eyes fixed on her quilt, though her hands had stopped moving. Miss Marple noted the way her fingers brushed the locket again, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone less observant. It must be difficult for you all, Miss Marple said softly. You worked so closely together. Mrs. Henshaw was such a presence, wasn't she? She was, Violet said, her tone clipped. But we'll manage. The circle will go on, I suppose, though it won't be the same. Mrs. Clements, hovering near the door, offered tea, and the conversation turned to safer topics: the weather, the upcoming bazaar, the quality of the wool Miss Marple had brought. But beneath the surface, Miss Marple sensed the currents of unease, the unspoken thoughts that darted like fish in a pond. She sipped her tea, listening as the women spoke, their words revealing more than they intended. Violet mentioned a recent dispute with Clara over the church fate's budget, her voice betraying a hint of bitterness. Eliza spoke of Clara's insistence on perfection, her cheeks flushing as she recalled a particularly harsh critique. Margaret's comments were laced with venom, her resentment of Clara palpable in every syllable. Laura, though quieter, let slip that Clara had promised to help her with a business venture, but had recently withdrawn her support. Beatrice remained silent, her contributions limited to murmurs of agreement. But Miss Marple noticed the way her eyes flickered when Clara's name was mentioned. As the meeting drew to a close, the women packed away their needles and thread, their movements slow, as if reluctant to leave the safety of the circle. Miss Marple rose, offering to help tidy up, and, as she gathered stray threads from the table, she took the opportunity to study the room. The quilt they were working on was a patchwork of blues and greens, its pattern intricate but not flawless, a reflection, perhaps, of the women who created it. Near Clara's usual chair was a small basket of sewing tools, including a pair of scissors that caught Miss Marple's eye. They were not as ornate as the ones found in Clara's chest, but their presence reminded her of the murder weapon, so personal, so deliberate. But Mrs. Clements escorted her to the door, her voice low. I don't know how they'll go on, she confided. Clara held them together, in her way. Without her, I'm afraid the circle might unravel. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Circles are strong things, Mrs. Clements. They hold, even when a thread is cut. But it will take time. As she stepped into the lane, the evening air cool against her face, Miss Marple's mind was busy, sorting through the impressions she had gathered. The sewing circle was a microcosm of St. Mary Mead, its members bound by habit and necessity, yet divided by their private grievances. Clara's death had exposed those divisions, and Miss Marple knew that the truth lay somewhere in the interplay of their personalities, their secrets, their unspoken desires. She thought of a housemaid she had known years ago, a girl named Rose who had seemed meek but had stolen a silver spoon out of spite. The act had been small, but the impulse behind its resentment, nurtured in silence, had been the same that might drive a woman to pick up a pair of scissors and strike. Violet's pride, Eliza's timidity, Margaret's bitterness, Laura's ambition, Beatrice's sorrow each was a thread, and Miss Marple was determined to follow them to their source. The church bell tolled 6, its sound carrying across the village, and Miss Marple turned toward home, her basket lighter now, but her mind heavy with questions. The sewing circle had given her a glimpse into the heart of the mystery, but it was only a glimpse. There was work to be done, conversations to be had, and truths to be uncovered. As she walked, her eyes caught the glint of a spider's web stretched across a hedgerow, its strands delicate but strong. A reminder that even the most fragile threads could hold a pattern together or tear it apart. Chapter 3. Asterisk. A thread of motive. The morning mist clung to the lanes of St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of the cottages and muffling the clatter of milk bottles as the delivery boy made his rounds. Miss Jane Marple stood at her sitting room window, her hands folded neatly before her, watching the village awaken. The dahlias in her garden bowed under the weight of dew, and the air carried the faint, earthy scent of autumn. Her knitting lay abandoned on the table, the scarf for her nephew Raymond untouched since yesterday's visit to the sewing circle. Her mind, however, was far from idle, weaving together the impressions she had gathered at the vicarage, each fragment a potential clue in the puzzle of Clara Henshaw's murder. Miss Marple turned from the window and settled into her armchair, her eyes resting on the photograph of Raymond on the mantelpiece. His cheerful grin, captured in a moment of London sophistication, seemed at odds with the somber task before her. Murder, she knew, was not a matter of grand gestures, but of small, human things: jealousy, greed, wounded pride. Clara's death, with its intimate weapon, suggested a motive rooted in the personal, and the sewing circle, with its tangle of relationships, was the place to start unraveling it. She had just taken up her teacup when a knock at the door announced the arrival of Lily, her young maid, who entered with a tray of toast and a gleam of excitement in her eyes. Lily, barely 20, had a knack for picking up village gossip, her ears as sharp as her polishing cloth. "Morning, Miss Marple," she said, setting the tray down. "The whole village is talking about Mrs. Henshaw. They say Inspector Craddock's been asking questions up at Rose Cottage, but he's not getting much out of anyone." Miss Marple smiled faintly, gesturing for Lily to sit. "And what does the village say, Lily? You always hear the most interesting things." Lily perched on the edge of a chair, her apron smoothed over her knees. "Well, miss, it's a right mess. Some say it was a thief, caught in the act, but there wasn't nothing taken. Not even Clara's silver teapot, and that's worth a pretty penny. Others think it was one of the sewing circle ladies, though no one can agree on which. Mrs. Greaves. She's been acting high and mighty, but folks say she's got debts piling up, and Clara was lording that inheritance of hers over everyone. Then there's Mrs. Dunn, who's been sour as lemons since Clara's brother left her at the altar, or near enough. And Miss Finch, that Ishii was all set to get Clara's help for some big plan in London. But Clara backed out, didn't. She made Laura proper cross." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression one of mild interest, though her mind was cataloguing every detail. And Mrs. Lane, Beatrice, isn't it? What do they say about her? Lily leaned forward, her voice dropping. She's the quiet one, miss, but folk have noticed her acting odd, always touching that locket of hers, like it's a talisman. Mrs. Bantry says Beatrice was at Clara's cottage more than you'd expect, dropping off thread or patterns, but always looking like she'd rather be elsewhere. Some say Clara knew something about Beatrice's husband, something she held over her, but no one's sure what. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly. Thank you, Lily. You've been most helpful. People do talk, don't they? And sometimes, what they don't say is as important as what they do. Lily blushed, pleased, and bustled off to her chores, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. The information, though second-hand, was a rich tapestry of motives, each thread leading back to the sewing circle. Clara's inheritance, a recent windfall from a distant cousin, had been the talk of the village, flaunted with the kind of pride that invited envy. Violet Greaves, with her crumbling finances, would have felt that sting keenly. Margaret Dunn's old wound, reopened by Clara's taunts, might have festered into something darker. Laura Finch's thwarted ambitions suggested a younger, more impulsive anger, and Beatrice Lane, with her locket and her secrets, hinted at a grief that Clara might have exploited. Miss Marple rose, her movements deliberate, and crossed to her writing desk, where she kept a small notebook for jotting down garden plans and, occasionally, observations of a less horticultural nature. She opened it now, her pen scratching softly as she listed the names. Violet Greaves, Eliza Trotter, Margaret Dunn, Laura Finch, Beatrice Lane. Beside each, she noted a word or two. Pride, faith, resentment, ambition, sorrow. These were the threads of motive, and somewhere among them lay the one that had led to murder. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Craddock, who knocked with the brisk authority of a man accustomed to being admitted. He was young, with a square jaw and earnest eyes, but there was a hint of frustration in his posture as he removed his hat and stepped inside. Miss Marple, he said, his voice warm but strained, I hope I'm not disturbing you. I thought you might have heard about the Henshaw case, and, well, I've learned to value your insights. Miss Marple gestured to a chair, her smile disarming. Not at all, Inspector. I was just having my morning tea. Would you care for a cup? And do tell me how your inquiries are progressing. Craddock sat, accepting the tea with a nod of thanks. It's a devil of a case, he admitted, running a hand through his hair. No fingerprints on the scissors, except Clara's own, which is odd, considering they were wiped clean. No sign of forced entry, so either she let her killer in, or they had a key. The sewing circle ladies all claimed they left the vicarage at 9, and Clara was seen walking home alone. But old Mr. Gibbs, who lives across the lane, swears he saw a cloaked figure leaving Rose Cottage around 10. Couldn't say who it was, those too dark. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with interest. A cloaked figure, she murmured. How very curious. And the scissors they definitely Clara's? Oh yes, Craddock said. Part of a set she kept on display, all silver and engraved. She was proud of them, showed them off. At the sewing circle, according to Mrs. Clements, makes it personal, doesn't it? Whoever used them knew they were there. Indeed, Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. A weapon chosen from the victim's own collection suggests familiarity, perhaps even intimacy. And the sewing circle, Inspector, have you spoken to them all? Craddock sighed, setting his cup down. I have, but their stories are vague. They were together until 9, tidying up after Clara left. Violet Greaves says she went straight home, alone. Eliza Trotter claims she stopped at the church to pray. Margaret Dunn says she walked with Laura Finch part way, then went home. Laura confirms it, but says she went to the post office to mail a letter. Beatrice Lane says she lingered at the vicarage to help Mrs. Clements, then went home. All plausible, but none airtight. And none of them admit to any real quarrel with Clara, though I can tell they're holding back. Miss Marple nodded, her fingers tapping lightly on the arm of her chair. People often hold back, Inspector, especially when they're frightened or ashamed. The sewing circle is a small world, and small worlds breed big resentments. Clara was not a woman to make friends easily, was she? Craddock gave a rueful smile. No, she wasn't. From what I hear, she had a tongue like a whip. Made enemies left and right, though no one's admitting to anything strong enough for murder. But there's something else Clara's solicitor let slip, that she'd recently changed her will. Left everything to Laura Finch, not her nephew. Who was expecting it? Laura claims she didn't know, but I'm not sure I believe her. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. A will, she said softly. That does complicate things. Money is such an old motive, isn't it? And yet, so reliable. Craddock leaned forward, his voice earnest. Miss Marple, you've got a way of seeing things I don't. If you hear anything at all, will you let me know? I'm up against a wall here. Of course, Inspector, she said, her tone reassuring. I shall keep my ears open. Village life is full of little clues, if one knows where to look. After Craddock left, Miss Marple returned to her notebook, adding a note about the will and the cloaked figure. The will was a new thread, one that pointed to Laura but could also implicate others who knew of it. Violet's debts, for instance, might she have hoped to influence Clara's fortune, or Margaret, whose bitterness might have been inflamed by Clara's wealth, and Beatrice, with her frequent visits to Rose Cottage, what had drawn her there, if not friendship. Miss Marple closed the notebook and rose, her eyes drifting to the garden. She thought of a village girl she had known years ago, a quiet thing who had seemed harmless until she poisoned her rival's tea over a man's affection. The motive had been love, twisted by jealousy, but the principle was the same. A small hurt, nursed in silence, could grow into something deadly. Clara's scissors, her wealth, her sharp tongue, these were the sparks that had ignited a fire. The question was, whose hand had fanned the flame? She decided to visit the village shop, where gossip flowed as freely as tea. Mrs. Weatherby, the shopkeeper, was a font of information, her memory as sharp as her scales. As Miss Marple donned her coat and hat, she felt the familiar stir of purpose. The sewing circle was a web, its strands delicate but strong, and somewhere within it lay the truth. She would follow each thread, no matter how fine, until she found the one that led to Clara Henshaw's killer. Chapter 4. Asterisk. The Scissors Tale. The afternoon sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the cobblestone lane that led to Rose Cottage, where Clara Henshaw had met her untimely end. The air was crisp, scented with wood smoke and the faint tang of fallen leaves, and the village seemed to hold its breath, as if wary of disturbing the uneasy peace that followed murder. Miss Jane Marple, her umbrella tucked under one arm and a basket of apples ostensibly meant for Mrs. Bantry, walked with her usual unhurried step, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. She had no official business at Rose Cottage, but she knew that a visit to the scene of the crime, however discreet, might yield insights that Inspector Craddock's more formal methods overlooked. Rose Cottage was a picture of rustic charm, its thatched roof sagging gently and its walls clad in climbing roses, now browning at the edges with the approach of autumn. The garden gate creaked as Miss Marple pushed it open, and she paused to note the neat flower beds, their marigolds and asters still vibrant despite neglect. A young constable, Reed, stood at the door, his face flushed with the importance of his duty. He recognized Miss Marple. At once her reputation in St. Mary Mead was as much a fixture as the church spiron tipped his hat. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, his tone respectful but cautious. "I'm afraid the cottage is still under police watch. Inspector Craddock's orders." Miss Marple smiled, her expression one of gentle innocence. "Oh, Constable Reed, I wouldn't dream of interfering. I was just passing by on my way to Mrs. Beatrice. She's been so shaken. Poor dear aunt, thought I might leave these apples for her. But since I'm here, might I have a quick word? It's such a dreadful business, and I do worry about the village." Reed hesitated, glancing over his shoulder, but Miss Marple's air of harmless curiosity was disarming. "Well, I suppose there's no harm in a word," he said. "But mind you don't touch anything. The inspector's been particular about that." "Of course," Miss Marple murmured, stepping into the hall as Reed held the door. The interior of Rose Cottage was as tidy as its garden, with polished wood floors and chintz curtains that fluttered faintly in the breeze from an open window. The parlor, where Clara had been found, was to the right, and Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to it immediately. She followed Reed, her steps soft, as if treading on sacred ground. The parlor was small but elegant, its walls adorned with framed samplers and a single watercolor of the Downs. An armchair, upholstered in faded green, sat near the hearth, its cushion still bearing the imprint of Clara's body. The rug beneath it was gone, taken for evidence, no doubt, stained as it was with blood. On a side table stood a wooden case, its lid open to reveal a collection of sewing scissors, there, silver handles gleaming dully in the light. One slot was empty, and Miss Marple needed no explanation to know it had held the murder weapon. "Those scissors," she said, her voice soft but deliberate. "They were Clara's pride, weren't they? I remember her showing them at the church. Fete last year. Such fine craftsmanship." Reed nodded, warming to the conversation. "Aye, miss, she was particular about them. Kept them polished and locked in that case, though she'd take them out to show off now and then. The pair that, well, that did the deed. They were her favorite, engraved with her initials. Funny thing, though, no fingerprints but hers, and they were smudged, like someone tried to wipe them clean." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the case, noting the care with which it was arranged. "A personal choice, then," she said, almost to herself. "One doesn't pick up such a thing by chance. And the room, was it like this when she was found?" "Near enough," Reed said, scratching his chin. "Mrs. Bantry found her, you know, just sitting there, like she'd nodded off. No sign of a struggle, nothing broken or out of place. The inspector thinks it was someone she knew, someone she let in without a fuss." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze sweeping the room. The absence of disorder was telling. It suggested trust, or at least familiarity. She stepped closer to the side table, careful not to touch anything, and peered at the remaining scissors. Their handles were ornate, etched with delicate patterns, but the empty slot drew her eye like a missing tooth. "They're not the sort," Of thing one leaves lying about, she remarked. Clara must have taken them out herself, or someone knew exactly where to find them. Reed looked at her curiously, as if sensing the weight of her words, but he said nothing. Miss Marple turned her attention to the window, which overlooked the lane. The curtains were drawn back, offering a clear view of the path to the gate. And Mr. Gibbs, across the way, she said, he saw someone leaving, didn't he? Around 10, I believe. That's right, Reed said. Old man's half blind, mind you, but he swears he saw a cloaked figure slipping out the gate. Couldn't say if it was a man or a woman, just a shadow moving quick. The inspector's not sure what to make of it. Gibbs isn't the most reliable witness. Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. Old eyes see more than we think. Sometimes, she said. Thank you, Constable. You've been most helpful. I'll just leave these apples with you for Mrs. Bantry, if I may. She handed over the basket, her movements slow and deliberate, giving her time to absorb the room's details, the faint scent of lavender, the neatly stacked books on a shelf, the single teacup on a tray, its saucer unblemished. Clara had been alone, or so it seemed, but the choice of weapon and the lack of struggle pointed to someone close, someone who knew her habits. Miss Marple thanked Reed again and stepped back into the lane, her mind already threading together the fragments she had gathered. As she walked toward the village green, she considered the scissors. They were not merely a weapon, but a symbol, a piece of Clara's identity. Whoever had used them had chosen them deliberately, perhaps to make a point, perhaps to ensure the act felt personal. Miss Marple recalled a village seamstress, years ago, who had slashed a rival's best dress with her own shears, a petty act born of envy. The impulse was not so different, she thought, though the stakes were far higher. Her next stop was the village hall, where Mrs. Bantry was organizing the church fete, her usual vigor tempered by the shock of her discovery. Miss Marple found her in the hall, surrounded by trestle tables, laden with jam jars and knitted goods. Mrs. Bantry, a robust woman with a hearty laugh, looked pale today, her hands fidgeting with a stack of leaflets. Jane, she exclaimed, spotting Miss Marple. Thank heaven you're here. I've been a wreck since yesterday. Finding Clara like that tells the sort of thing you read about in books, not in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple took her arm, guiding her to a chair. It must have been dreadful, Dolly. Tell me, if you can, what you saw. It might help the inspector, you know. Mrs. Bantry shuddered, her voice low. It was just past 9:30, I think. I'd promised to drop off some bunting for the fete, and Clara said she'd be home after the sewing circle. I knocked, but there was no answer, so I let myself in. The door was unlocked, you see. And there she was, in her armchair, with those scissors. Oh, Jane, it was awful. She looked so peaceful, almost, but the blood. She trailed off, her hand to her mouth. Miss Marple patted her arm, her voice soothing. There, Dolly. You did the right thing, calling the police. Did you notice anything else? Anyone nearby, perhaps? Mrs. Bantry shook her head. Not a soul. The lane was quiet, and the cottage was dark, except for the parlor lamp. I didn't see anyone, but then I wasn't looking. I was too shaken to think straight. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the timeline. Clara had left the vicarage at 9, and Mr. Gibbs saw a cloaked figure at 10. Mrs. Bantry found her shortly before, suggesting the murder occurred within that hour. The unlocked door was curious. Clara was known for her caution, locking up even during the day. Had she let her killer in, or had they entered uninvited, knowing she was alone? As she left Mrs. Bantry to her work, Miss Marple walked slowly toward the church, her thoughts circling the scissors. They were a clue, not just to the act, but to the person behind it. Someone who knew Clara's habits, who had access to her parlor, who chose a weapon that carried weight beyond its blade. The sewing circle loomed large in her mind. Violet's pride, Eliza's timidity, Margaret's resentment, Laura's ambition, Beatrice's sorrow. Each had a reason to dislike Clara, but which had the nerve to act? She paused at the churchyard, where the yew trees stood sentinel, their branches heavy with shadow. A memory surfaced of a village boy who had once stolen a knife from his father's shop, not to use it, but to prove he could. The act had been childish, but the impulse in defiance, was universal. Clara's scissors, like that knife, were a statement, and Miss Marple was determined to understand what it said. As the church clock struck 4, she turned toward home, her umbrella tapping the ground. The scissors' tail was not yet complete, but it was beginning to take shape, a pattern forming in the threads of motive and opportunity. She would need to speak to the sewing circle again, to watch their hands and their eyes, to listen for the silences that spoke louder than words. For in St. Mary Mead, as in any village, the truth was woven into the everyday, waiting for someone with the patience to unravel it. Chapter 5. A stitch in time. The evening settled over St. Mary Mead with a gentle hush. The sky, a deepening indigo, pricked with the first faint stars. Miss Jane Marple sat by her fire, the glow casting soft shadows across her sitting room, where the air smelled of lavender polish and the faint, comforting scent of her earlier tea. Her knitting lay in her lap, the cables of Raymond's scarf growing slowly under her deft fingers, but her mind was far from the wool. The visit to Rose Cottage had sharpened her focus. The image of Clara's scissor silver, engraved, intimate lingering, like a note struck on a tuning fork. The murder was a puzzle, its pieces scattered across the village, and Miss Marple knew that patience, not haste, would fit them together. She rose, setting her knitting aside, and crossed to the window, where the lights of St. Mary Mead twinkled like fireflies in the dusk. The village was quiet, its routines undisturbed on the surface. Yet beneath lay a current of unease, a ripple from Clara Henshaw's death that touched every hearth. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the sewing circle, its members bound by their shared craft, but divided by their secrets. The scissors, the cloaked figure, the unlocked door, these were threads. But the motive, the why of it all, was the knot she needed to unravel. Her musings were interrupted by the arrival of Lily, her maid, who entered with a tray of cocoa and a gleam of fresh gossip in her eyes. Lily's knack for picking up village talk was a resource Miss Marple valued, for what the village whispered often held more truth than what it shouted. "Evening," Miss Lily said, setting the tray on the table. "I've just come from the shop, and you wouldn't believe the talk. Everyone's got a theory about Mrs. Henshaw, and none of it's kind." Miss Marple settled back in her armchair, gesturing for Lily to sit. "Do tell me, Lily," she said, her voice warm with encouragement. "What are they saying now?" Lily perched on a stool, her hands clasped eagerly. "Well, miss, it's all about Clara's money. Mostly, Mrs. Weatherby at the shop says Clara got a tidy sum from her cousin's estate a few months back. Thousands, they reckon. She was flashing it about, buying new curtains. Talking about a trip to Bath made some folk jealous, especially Mrs. Greaves, who's been selling off her jewellery to keep up appearances. Mr. Weatherby heard Violet muttering about it at the post. office, saying Clara had no right to lord it over everyone. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes thoughtful. Violet Greaves's pride was a fragile thing, and Clara's wealth would have been a bitter pill. And the others, she prompted. What do they say about the sewing circle? Lily leaned forward, her voice dropping. Mrs. Bantry says Mrs. Dunn Margaret, that is, never got over Clara's brother jilting her. It was years ago, mind, but Clara kept bringing it up, like a needle in a wound. Margaret's been snappish ever since, especially at the circle. Then there's Miss Finch, Laura, who was counting on Clara's money for some scheme in London dressmaking or some such. Clara promised to help, but backed out last minute, said Laura wasn't ready. Laura was furious, Mrs. Weatherby says, stormed out of Rose Cottage a week ago, looking like she'd spit nails. Miss Marple sipped her cocoa, her expression serene but her mind racing. Money and resentment were old motives, but they never lost their power. And Mrs. Lane, she asked. Beatrice, the quiet one. What do they say about her? Lily's brow furrowed. She's a bit of a mystery. Miss Folk say she was close to Clara, always running errands for her, taking patterns or thread to the cottage. But Mrs. Bantry reckons Beatrice didn't like. It said she looked nervous every time she went. There's talk Clara knew something about Beatrice's husband, something from the war. No one knows what, but Beatrice has been clutching that locket of hers tighter than ever since Clara died. Miss Marple's fingers paused on her cup, her eyes narrowing slightly. Beatrice's locket, a constant in her quiet demeanour, was a clue she had noted at the vicarage. Thank you, Lily, she said. You've given me much to think about. Gossip is like a quilt, isn't it? Full of patches, but sometimes you find the pattern. Lily blushed, pleased, and left to tend the kitchen, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. She opened her notebook, where she had jotted the names of the sewing circle: Violet Greaves, Eliza Trotter, Margaret Dunn, Laura Finch, Beatrice Lane. Beside Violet, she added debts, envy. Beside Margaret, old grudge. Beside Laura, thwarted ambition. Beside Beatrice, secret, locket. Eliza, timid and devout, remained a question mark, her motive less clear, though Clara's attacks on her faith might have stung deeper than she let on. The fire crackled, and Miss Marple's mind turned to the scissors again. Their choice as a weapon was deliberate, a message woven into the act. Clara's pride in her collection, her habit of displaying it, suggested someone who knew her well, someone who had been in her parlor often enough to know where the scissors were kept. The sewing circle was the obvious link, but Miss Marple knew better than to assume. Villages were full of hidden connections, and St. Mary Mead was no exception. She decided to visit the village jeweller, Mr. Hargreaves, whose shop was a treasure trove of trinkets and secrets. Beatrice's locket had caught her eye, and Lily's mention of a possible secret tied to her husband intrigued her. Mr. Hargreaves, a wiry man with a jeweller sloop ever at hand, was known for his discretion, but Miss Marple had a way of coaxing information without seeming to pry. The next morning, she donned her coat and hat, her umbrella a precaution against the threatening clouds, and made her way to the shop. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, and Mr. Hargreaves looked up from his workbench, his eyes brightening. Miss Marple, a pleasure, as always. Come for a new brooch, or is it something else? Miss Marple smiled, her tone light. Oh, nothing so grand, Mr. Hargreaves. I was just thinking of Mrs. Lane Beatrice, you know. She wears such a pretty locket, and I wondered if you'd made it. You do such fine work. Hargreaves beamed, setting aside his tools. That locket. I made it for her years ago, just after her husband passed. Simple silver, but she wanted it to hold a lock of his hair. Very particular about it, she was. Said it was all she had left of him. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle curiosity. How touching. She must treasure it. I suppose she's had it repaired now. And then? Once or twice, Hargreaves said, polishing a ring absently. Last time was a few months back. The clasp was loose, and she was worried about losing the hair. She was in a state, poor thing. Said it was her last link to him. I fixed it. Up quick, no charge. Miss Marple thanked him and left, her mind turning over this new thread. Beatrice's locket was more than a keepsake. It was a talisman, a link to a past that Clara might have known about. Had Clara used that knowledge, taunting Beatrice as she had taunted others? Miss Marple recalled a village woman long ago who had kept a locket with a secret letter inside, a letter that had led to blackmail and ruin. The parallel was not exact, but it was suggestive. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her notebook open. The scissors, the locket, the cloaked figure, they were pieces of a pattern, but the motive remained elusive. Violet's debts, Margaret's grudge, Laura's anger, Beatrice's secret each was a possibility, but none yet felt like the truth. Eliza, too, lingered in her mind, her quiet faith perhaps hiding a deeper wound. Miss Marple knew that faith could be a shield, but also a spark, igniting when pressed too hard. She thought of Inspector Craddock's mention of the will, Laura's unexpected inheritance. Had Clara told anyone of her decision? Violet, struggling to maintain her status, might have seen it as a betrayal. Margaret, nursing her old pain, might have resented Clara's wealth going to a young upstart. Beatrice's visits to Rose Cottage suggested a closeness, but also a tension, perhaps born of something Clara held over her as the fire burned low. Miss Marple closed her notebook, her eyes on the flickering flames. She recalled a village scandal. Years passed, where a woman had killed her sister over a shared inheritance, the act born of years of quiet resentment. The motive had seemed small to outsiders, but to the sisters it was everything. Clara's death, she sensed, was like that, a small, human thing, magnified by time and circumstance. She rose, her movements slow but purposeful. Tomorrow she would attend the church service, where the sewing circle would likely be present. There, in the quiet of the pews, she could watch them, note their glances, their silences. The truth, she knew, was in the details, the way a hand touched a locket, the way a voice faltered on a name. A stitch in time, she thought, could save a life or reveal a killer. And Miss Marple, with her patient, unerring eye, was determined to find it. Chapter 6. Asterisk. The Vicar's Teeth of Vicarage Garden was a haven of late autumn colour, its borders ablaze with asters and goldenrod, though a chill in the air hinted at the winter to come. Miss Jane Marple, her hat pinned firmly against the breeze, walked the short distance from her cottage to the vicarage, a tin of homemade shortbread tucked in her basket as a pretext for her visit. The invitation to tea had been her own suggestion, made to Mrs. Clements with a gentle insistence that masked her true purpose, to observe the sewing circle in a setting less formal than their weekly meetings, where the constraints of routine might loosen tongues and reveal truths. Clara Henshaw's murder hung over St. Mary Mead like a fog, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, was determined to pierce it. The vicarage drawing-room, where the sewing circle had met only days before, was transformed for the occasion. The oak table, usually strewn with fabric and thread, now held a lace cloth, a silver teapot, and a spread of sandwiches and scones. Reverend Clements, a lanky man with a perpetually distracted air, stood by the fire, his spectacles slipping down his nose as he greeted Miss Marple. "Miss Marple, how good of you to come," he said, his voice warm but tinged with unease. "It's a sad time for the village, but tea, I find, has a way of soothing the spirit." "Indeed it does, Reverend," Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles as she handed Mrs. Clements the shortbread. "And it's so kind of you to host us. I thought a little gathering might do us all good, after such a shock." The sewing circle members arrived one by one, their faces a study in contrasts. Mrs. Violet Greaves swept in with her usual air of grandeur, her navy dress immaculate despite the rumors of her dwindling funds. Her smile was tight, her eyes darting to the others as if assessing their mood. Miss Eliza Trotter followed, clutching a small prayer book, her grey bonnet slightly askew and her lips moving in a silent litany. Mrs. Margaret Dunn entered with a scowl, her sharp features set in a mask of disapproval, as if the very act of attending was an imposition. Miss Laura Finch, her auburn hair pinned loosely, seemed restless, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her skirt. Mrs. Beatrice Lane was last, her step hesitant, her hand brushing the silver locket at her throat as she murmured a greeting. Mrs. Clements bustled about, pouring tea and offering plates, her chatter a valiant attempt to dispel the tension. "Such a lovely day, isn't it?" she said, passing a cup to Violet. "The garden's holding up well, despite the frost. I do think we'll have a fine show at the bazaar, thanks to your quilts." Violet nodded, her voice cool. Clara would have insisted on perfection, of course. She had such standards. The words were neutral, but there was an edge to them, a hint of resentment that Miss Marple noted. Eliza's hands trembled as she took her cup, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not right, meeting without her. She was the heart of the circle, whatever her faults." Margaret snorted, stirring her tea with unnecessary vigor. "Heart, more like the whip hand. Clara never let us forget who was in charge. I dare say we'll manage without her." Laura flushed, her green eyes flashing. "That's unkind, Margaret. Clara could be hard, but she believed in us. She was going to help me." She stopped, biting her lip, as if realizing she had said too much. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression one of gentle interest. "It's natural to feel her absence," she said. "She was such a force, wasn't she? I remember her at the last fete, organizing everything down to the last stitch. You must all have stories of her." The invitation was subtle, but it opened a floodgate of cautious reminiscences. Violet spoke of Clara's insistence on quality, her tone suggesting irritation rather than admiration. Eliza recalled a moment when Clara had mocked her choice of him for the church service, her cheeks reddening at the memory. Margaret's anecdotes were laced with bitterness, each one a jab at Clara's domineering ways. Laura's contributions were guarded, focusing on Clara's promises of support, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of anger. Beatrice, however, remained silent, her gaze fixed on her locket, her fingers tracing its outline. Miss Marple watched them closely, noting the small gestures that spoke louder than words. Violet's rigid posture, as if bracing for a blow. Eliza's nervous glances at the door, as if expecting Clara's ghost. Margaret's clenched jaw, Laura's restless hands, Beatrice's distraction. When the conversation lulled, Miss Marple turned to Beatrice, her voice soft. That's such a lovely locket, Mrs. Lane. A family piece, is it? Beatrice started, her hand dropping from the locket as if burned. Oh yes, it was my husband's, she said, her voice low. He gave it to me before he went to the war. She hesitated, then added, It's all I have of him. How touching, Miss Marple said, her tone sympathetic but her eyes sharp. It must mean a great deal to you. I suppose Clara admired it too. She had such an eye for fine things. Beatrice's face paled, and she looked away, murmuring something inaudible. Miss Marple did not press, but the reaction was telling. She recalled Lily's gossip about Beatrice's frequent visits to Rose Cottage, and Mr. Hargreaves's mention of the locket's significance. Had Clara known something about Beatrice's husband, something that stirred shame or fear? The conversation shifted to the bazaar, but Miss Marple steered it gently back to Clara. She was so proud of her scissors. Wasn't she? She said, addressing the group. I saw them at the fete last year, all polished and gleaming. Such a tragedy they were used. Well, as they were. Eliza gasped, her cup clattering in its saucer. It's wicked, using her own scissors like that. It's like a judgment. Violet's lips thinned. A judgment, more like a convenience. They were there, weren't they? Anyone could have picked them up. Anyone who knew where they were kept, Margaret said sharply. Clara didn't leave them lying about. She was particular about that case. Laura's cheeks flushed again, but she said nothing, her eyes fixed on her hands. Beatrice's fingers tightened on her locket, and Miss Marple noted the gesture, filing it away with the others. The scissors, she thought, were not just a weapon, but a key. Unlocking the killer's relationship with Clara, someone close, someone trusted, or someone bold enough to enter her parlor uninvited. Reverend Clements, who had been listening quietly, spoke up, his voice hesitant. I saw Clara that last evening, before she left the vicarage. She seemed preoccupied, I thought, not her usual self. I wondered if something was troubling her. Miss Marple turned to him, her interest piqued. Preoccupied, Reverend. In what way? He adjusted his spectacles, frowning. Hard to say, exactly. She was sharp with the others, as usual, but there was a restlessness about her. She kept glancing at the clock, as if eager to leave. I thought perhaps she was expecting someone. The women exchanged glances, their expressions guarded. Violet spoke first, her voice crisp. She didn't mention anything to me. She was her usual self, bossy, critical. If she was expecting someone, she kept it to herself. Eliza nodded, her voice trembling. She did seem in a hurry, now that you mention it. But I thought it was just her way. She always liked to be home by dark. Margaret's eyes narrowed. If she was expecting someone, it wasn't one of us. We were all at the vicarage until 9, and she left alone. Laura said nothing, but her fingers twisted in her skirt, a gesture Miss Marple noted. Beatrice remained silent, her gaze distant, her hand still on her locket. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind weaving the new information into the pattern. Clara's restlessness, the cloaked figure seen by Mr. Gibbs, the unlocked door, suggested a meeting, planned or unplanned, that had ended in violence. As the tea drew to a close, the women rose, their movements stiff, as if reluctant to leave the warmth of the vicarage. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Clements, her eyes lingering on Beatrice, whose pallor had not faded. As she walked home through the darkening lanes, the village quiet, save for the rustle of leaves, she thought of a parlour maid she had known in her youth. A girl who had seemed meek but had cut her rival's best shawl out of spite. The act had been petty, but the impulse jealousy, nursed in silence, was not unlike what might drive a woman to murder. Beatrice's locket, Clara's restlessness, the scissors, these were threads in a tapestry of motive and opportunity. Violet's pride, wounded by Clara's wealth, Eliza's faith, mocked by Clara's sharp tongue, Margaret's old grudge, Laura's thwarted dreams. Beatrice's hidden sorrowage was a possibility, but none yet felt complete. Miss Marple knew that the truth lay in the small things, the glances and silences, the objects that carried meaning beyond their form. She reached her cottage, the windows glowing softly, and paused at the gate, her eyes on the stars above. The vicar's tea had given her glimpses of the pattern, but it was not yet clear. She would need to watch, to listen, to follow the threads wherever they led. For in St. Mary Mead, as in any village, the truth was a delicate thing, easily overlooked, but never truly hidden. And Miss Marple, with her patient, unerring eye, was determined to find it. Chapter 7. A tangled thread. The morning broke over St. Mary Mead with a tentative sun, its rays piercing the mist that clung to the meadows and rooftops. Miss Jane Marple sat at her breakfast table, a modest spread of toast and marmalade before her, though her attention was not on the meal. Her notebook lay open, its pages filled with neat, spidery handwriting, names, motives, fragments of conversations from the vicar's tea. The fire in the grate snapped softly, casting a warm glow across the room, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, threading through the labyrinth of Clara Henshaw's murder. The scissors, the cloaked figure, Beatrice's locket, these were pieces of a pattern, but the motive, the heart of the matter, remained elusive. She sipped her tea, her pale blue eyes fixed on the notebook. The sewing circle loomed large, Violet Greaves's pride, stung by Clara's wealth, Eliza Trotter's faith, bruised by Clara's scorn, Margaret Dunn's old grudge, festering like a wound, Laura Finch's ambition, thwarted by Clara's withdrawal, Beatrice Lane's sorrow, tied to that locket and a past Clara might have exploited, Inspector Craddock's revelation about the will Clara's fortune left to Laura. Not her nephew had added a new thread, one that tangled the others further. Miss Marple knew that truth often hid in the knots, the places where threads crossed and pulled tight. A knock at the door broke her reverie, and Lily entered, her cheeks flushed from the morning chill. "Morning, miss," she said, setting a fresh pot of tea on the table. "The village is all abuzz again. They say Inspector Craddock's been poking around the sewing circle ladies' houses, asking questions. Mrs. Weatherby says he's got nothing solid, though, and folk are starting to whisper he's in over his head." Miss Marple smiled, her expression gentle but her mind alert. "Poor Inspector Craddock. He's doing his best, I'm sure. What else do they say, Lily? You always hear the freshest news." Lily perched on a chair, eager to share. "Well, miss, it's mostly about that will. Everyone's talking about how Laura Finch got Clara's money, and her not even knowing, or so she says. Mrs. Bantry reckons Laura's putting on an act. Says she saw her arguing with Clara at the cottage a fortnight ago, something about money for London. Then there's Mrs. Greaves' Violet. That is, Mr. Weatherby says she's been selling off more jewellery, and Clara knew about her debts, made no secret of it. Made Violet proper mad, I hear." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers tapping the notebook. "And Mrs. Dunn, or Mrs. Lane, any whispers about them?" Lily's eyes widened. "Mrs. Dunn's been snapping at everyone, more than usual. They say she's been muttering about Clara's brother again, how he left her high and dry. As for Mrs. Lane Beatrice, she's been quieter than ever. Mrs. Weatherby saw her at the church yesterday, just sitting by her husband's grave, looking like she'd seen a ghost. Folks say Clara used to talk about Beatrice's husband, hinting at things best left alone. No one knows what, but it upset Beatrice something fierce. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her mind turning over Beatrice's locket and the jeweller's. Words, a lock of hair, a husband's memory. Clara's knowledge of it suggested a leverage that could wound deeply. "Thank you, Lily," she said. "You've been most helpful. Gossip is like a breeze, isn't it? It carries things we might not otherwise see." Lily grinned, scurrying off to her chores, and Miss Marple returned to her notebook, adding a note beside Beatrice's name. Husband's secret. The will, she thought, was a complicating factor. Laura's inheritance made her an obvious suspect, but her surprise, if genuine, suggested others might have known of Clara's decision. Violet's debts made her a candidate for desperation. Margaret's bitterness could have flared at the thought of Clara's wealth passing to another. Beatrice's visits to Rose Cottage, her locket, her grief, something there tugged at Miss Marple's intuition, like a snag in a seam. She decided to call on Inspector Craddock, who had taken to visiting her for advice. His youthful confidence tempered by the case's complexity. She sent a note via Lily, inviting him for tea, and by mid-morning he arrived, his face lined with fatigue, but his eyes bright with determination. He settled into her armchair, accepting a cup with a grateful nod. "Miss Marple," he said, "I'm at my wit's end. The sewing circle ladies are like a closed book. I've searched their homes, nothing out of the ordinary, no blood-stained cloaks or hidden scissors. Laura Finch swears she didn't know about the will, but I'm not convinced. Violet Greaves admits to debts, but says she'd never stoop to murder. Margaret Dunn's bitter as gall, but her alibi's tight. She was seen at the pub with a neighbour after the vicarage. Eliza Trotter's too timid to swat a fly, and Beatrice Lane just cries when I ask about Clara. I'm missing something, aren't I?" Miss Marple poured herself a cup, her movements deliberate. "You're doing fine work, Inspector," she said. "But murder is like a quilt. Sometimes the pattern only shows when you step back. Tell me, have you looked into Clara's past? Not just her money, but her relationships. She was a woman who made enemies, I think." Craddock nodded, pulling a notebook from his pocket. "I've dug a bit. Clara's brother, Robert, caused a stir years ago when he broke off with Margaret Dunn, left her for a girl in London, and Clara never let Margaret forget it. Then there's Violet's husband, who lost a land deal to Clara's cousin, the one who left her the money. Violet's been struggling ever since. Laura was Clara's protégée, but they fell out over Laura's plans for London. As for Beatrice, there's a rumour Clara knew something about her husband's death in the Walsam scandal, though no one's clear on it." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "A scandal," she murmured. "That's interesting. And the cloaked figure, Mr. Gibson-y progress there." Craddock sighed. "Gibbs sticks to his story, but he can't describe the figure. Too dark, he says. I've checked the Lano footprints, no dropped items. Whoever it was knew how to move quietly." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to Beatrice. The locket, the visits, the rumour of a scandal, something connected Clara to Beatrice's husband, something that might have pushed a gentlewoman to a desperate act. She recalled a village widow years ago who had burned a letter that hinted at her husband's infidelity, her face calm but her hands shaking. The act had been small, but the emotion behind it was fierce. Could Beatrice have acted on such a feeling? "Inspector," she said, "have you considered the scissors themselves? Not just as a weapon, but as a choice." Clara's pride in them was well known. Someone who used them knew her habits, her parlor. "It's a personal act, don't you think?" Craddock's brow furrowed. "You're right. It's not like grabbing a knife from the kitchen. The killer had to know where they were kept, maybe even took them out of the case. That points to someone close, someone from the circle, most likely. Or someone who visited often," Miss Marple said softly, her eyes on her teacup. "Mrs. Lane, for instance. I hear she was often at Rose Cottage." Craddock's eyes sharpened. "Beatrice. She's the least likely, I thought. Too quiet, too broken. But you're right, she admitted to dropping off patterns for Clara. More than the others. I'll look into her again." Miss Marple smiled, her tone gentle. "Look into all of them, Inspector. People are like threads, sometimes the quietest ones hold the strongest pull." After Craddock left, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her notebook open. She added a note about Clara's brother and the land deal, threads that tied Margaret and Violet to deeper motives. But Beatrice lingered in her mind, her locket a symbol of something unspoken. Miss Marple thought of the cloaked figure, the unlocked door, the scissors. Had Beatrice stayed behind at the vicarage, as she claimed, or had she followed Clara home, driven by a secret too painful to bear? She rose, her movements slow but purposeful, and decided to visit the churchyard where Beatrice had been seen. By her husband's grave, the church was a short walk, its spire a familiar landmark against the grey sky. As she entered the churchyard, the use whispered in the breeze, and she found the grave easily. Captain Thomas Lane died in 1917. The stone was weathered but clean, a small posy of violets laid at its base. Miss Marple stood, her umbrella a shield against the drizzle, and pictured Beatrice here, her locket in hand, her heart heavy with memory. A memory surfaced, of a village girl who had kept a secret about her lover's death, a secret that led to a quiet, desperate act. Beatrice's sorrow, Miss Marple thought, was not just grief, but something sharper, something Clara might have twisted to her advantage. The truth was close. She felt tangled in the threads of past and present. She would need to watch Beatrice, to listen for the silences that spoke of guilt or pain, that as she walked home. The village settling into evening, Miss Marple's mind was a loom, weaving the threads of motive and opportunity. The sewing circle was a knot, its members bound by resentment and secrets. Somewhere among them was the hand that had wielded the scissors, and Miss Marple, with her patient, unerring eye, was determined to find it. Chapter 8. Asterisk. The shadow in the lane, the twilight draped St. Mary Mead in a soft, grey veil, the kind that blurred edges and made the familiar seem strange. Miss Jane Marple, her coat buttoned against the evening chill, stepped out from her cottage, her umbrella in hand, though the sky was clear. The village was settling into its nightly hush, with only the occasional glow of a window or the distant bark of a dog breaking the stillness. Her purpose was not a social call, but a quiet reconnaissance, prompted by the threads of suspicion that had tightened around Beatrice Lane, the locket, the rumoured scandal, the frequent visits to Rose Cottage. These were clues, delicate but insistent, and Miss Marple felt the need to follow them, quite literally. Into the dusk, her destination was Rose Cottage. Not to enter, but to observe the lane that ran beside it, where old Mr. Gibbs had seen his cloaked figure on the night of Clara Henshaw's murder. Miss Marple's steps were measured, her sensible shoes silent on the damp grass that edged the path. She knew the value of discretion. In a village like St. Mary Mead, an old lady out for an evening stroll raised no eyebrows, but her eyes missed nothing, and her mind was as sharp as the scissors that had ended Clara's life. As she neared the cottage, its thatched roof a dark silhouette against the fading light, she paused, her gaze sweeping the lane. It was narrow, bordered by hedgerows on one side and the cottage's garden wall on the other. A perfect funnel for someone wishing to move unseen. The gate, where Mr. Gibbs had spotted the figure, was just visible, its latch glinting faintly. Miss Marple stood, her umbrella a prop to lean on, and let her thoughts drift to that night. Clara leaving the vicarage at 9, the sewing circle dispersing, the figure slipping away at 10. The timeline was tight, the act deliberate, and the cloak suggested a desire for concealment not just from Gibbs's prying eyes, but from the village itself. A flicker of movement caught her attention, a shadow shifting near the gate. Her heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. She stepped closer, keeping to the grass, and saw a figure emerge from the line of sight, cloaked form moving with a hurried grace. The cloak was dark, its hood drawn up, but as the figure passed under a street lamp's feeble glow, Miss Marple glimpsed a flash of silver at the throat. A locket, perhaps. Her breath caught, and she followed at a distance, her steps soft but steady, her umbrella tapping lightly as if to mark her presence as innocent. The figure moved toward the churchyard, its path weaving through the lanes with a familiarity that spoke of habits. Miss Marple, though not as spry as in her youth, kept pace, her knowledge of St. Mary Mead's shortcuts serving her well. She recalled a village poacher she had known years ago, a man who moved like a ghost through the lanes, his guilt betrayed only by the twitch of his hands. This figure, she sensed, carried a similar burden, though its nature was yet unclear. As the churchyard gate creaked open, Miss Marple slowed, her eyes adjusting to the deeper gloom. The yews loomed like sentinels, their branches casting intricate shadows across the graves. The figure knelt by a headstone, its cloak pooling on the ground, and Miss Marple recognized the spot, Captain Thomas Lane's grave, where Beatrice had been seen before. She approached quietly, her umbrella now a shield against the breeze, and cleared her throat softly. "Mrs. Lane," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Is that you, dear?" Beatrice started, her hood falling back to reveal her pale face, her eyes wide with alarm. The locket gleamed at her throat, its silver catching the faint light. "Miss Marple," she gasped, rising unsteadily. I didn't hear you. I was just visiting Thomas." Miss Marple smiled, her expression one of kindly concern. "Of course, my dear, it's a peaceful place to remember him, but it's rather late, isn't it, and cold. I was out for a walk myself, and saw you in the lane. I hope I haven't startled you." Beatrice's hands fluttered to her locket, her voice trembling. "No, not at all. I often come here, you know. It's quiet, Thomas. He's all I have left." Her eyes darted to the lane, as if fearing pursuit, and Miss Marple noted the tension in her posture, the way her fingers clutched the locket like a lifeline. "It must be a comfort," Miss Marple said, stepping closer. "That locket is so pretty. I believe Mr. Hargreaves made it, didn't he? For your husband's memory?" Beatrice nodded, her gaze dropping to the grave. "Yes, it holds his hair. It's precious to me." Clarucci understood that. She was kind about it. Sometimes her voice faltered, and Miss Marple caught the hesitation, the hint of something unsaid. "Clara was a complex woman," Miss Marple said softly. "Not always kind, perhaps, But she knew people, didn't she? I suppose she knew a great deal about everyone in the sewing circle. Beatrice's face tightened, her fingers tightening on the locket. She did, she whispered. She knew my pain, how much I missed Thomas. But she used it against me, sometimes. Said things that hurt. She stopped, her eyes filling with tears, and Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on her arm. There, she said. It's hard to speak of such things, I know, but Clara's gone now, and her words can't hurt you anymore. Did she say something that night, at the vicarage? Something that upset you? Beatrice shook her head, but the gesture was too quick, too desperate. No, nothing special. She was just Clara. I stayed to help Mrs. Clemens, then went home. I didn't see her after she left. Her voice cracked, and she turned away, her cloak rustling as she knelt again by the grave. Miss Marple watched her, her mind racing. Beatrice's fear, her evasiveness, the cloak, they pointed to something more than grief. Had she been the figure Mr. Gibbs saw, slipping from Rose Cottage after a fatal confrontation? The locket, the visits, Clara's knowledge of a scandal. Miss Marple recalled a village woman, long ago, who had killed to silence a rumor about her lover's death. The act had been born of desperation, a need to protect a cherished memory. Could Beatrice have acted from a similar impulse? I'll leave you to your thoughts, dear, Miss Marple said, her tone kind but her eyes sharp. But do take care. The lanes are dark, and it's easy to stumble. Beatrice nodded, her face hidden, and Miss Marple turned back toward the lane, her umbrella tapping the ground. The churchyard was silent, save for the rustle of leaves and the faint sob that followed her departure. She walked slowly, her thoughts weaving a pattern from the evening's encounter. Beatrice's cloak, her presence in the lane, her reaction. To Clara's name these were threads, and they were tightening round her. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her notebook open. She added a note beside Beatrice's name. Cloak, churchyard, fear. The locket, she thought, was more than a keepsake. It was a symbol of something Clara had exploited, perhaps a secret about Thomas Lane's death. Had Clara taunted Beatrice that night, pushing her to a breaking point? The scissors, chosen from Clara's own collection, suggested a personal act, a moment of rage or despair. She recalled Inspector Craddock's mention of the will, Laura's inheritance, and the cloaked figure. Beatrice's alibi lingering at the vicarage was plausible, but Mrs. Clemens had been vague about the timing. Had Beatrice followed Clara home, cloaked to avoid notice, and entered the unlocked door? Miss Marple thought of Violet's debts, Margaret's grudge, Laura's ambition, Eliza's timidity. But Beatrice's sorrow felt different, deeper, a motive that resonated with the intimacy of the murder. As the fire burned low, Miss Marple closed her notebook, her eyes on the flames. She pictured the lane, the shadow moving silently, the glint of a locket in the dark. The truth was close, she felt, hidden in the folds of Beatrice's cloak, in the weight of her grief. She would need to speak to Mrs. Clements again, to clarify Beatrice's movements, and perhaps to Beatrice herself, to press gently on the wound of her past. For in St. Mary Mead, the shadows held secrets, and Miss Marple, with her quiet, unerring eye, was determined to bring them to light. Chapter 9. The pattern emerges. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of St. Mary Mead's vicarage, casting intricate shadows across the drawing room where the sewing circle gathered once more. The air was heavy with the scent of beeswax and the faint must of old books, but an undercurrent of unease lingered, sharper now than at their last meeting. Clara Henshaw's absence was a void, her empty chair a silent accusation, and the women's needles moved with a restless energy as if stitching could mend the fracture in their circle. Miss Jane Marple, her basket of wool a pretext for her presence, sat near the window, her knitting needles clicking softly, her eyes missing nothing. Mrs. Clements, ever the gracious hostess, bustled about with a tray of biscuits, her chatter a valiant effort to restore normalcy. "Such a fine day for sewing," she said, her voice bright but strained. "The quilt is coming along nicely, don't you think?" Clara would have been pleased. The women murmured agreement, but their responses were tepid. Mrs. Violet Greaves, her posture as stiff as her starched blouse, stitched with mechanical precision, her lips a thin line. Miss Eliza Trotter's hands trembled, her needle catching in the fabric as her eyes darted to the door. Mrs. Margaret Dunn's stitches were sharp and quick, her expression sour as she muttered about the thread's quality. Miss Laura Finch, her auburn hair catching the light, worked with a distracted air, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. Mrs. Beatrice Lane, her locket gleaming at her throat, was the quietest, her stitches uneven, her gaze fixed on the quilt as if it held answers. Miss Marple, ostensibly there to mend a quilt square, had come to observe, to listen, to catch the threads of truth in the women's words and silences. Her encounter with Beatrice in the churchyard, cloaked and nervous, had tightened her suspicions, but she knew better than to leap to conclusions. The scissors, the will, the cloaked figure, these were pieces of a pattern, and today she hoped to see it take shape. She began with a gentle remark, her voice soft as the morning light. "This quilt is quite lovely," she said, holding up a square of blue and green patchwork. "Clara had such an eye for patterns, didn't she? I remember her organizing the bazaar last year, everything so precise. She must have been a guiding light for you all." Violet's needle paused, her eyes narrowing. "She was particular, I'll give her that," she said, her tone cool. "To particular, sometimes, always had to have the final say, even on things that didn't matter." Eliza's cheeks flushed, her voice a whisper. "She meant well, I think. She wanted the circle to be the best it could be. Though she wasn't always kind about it." Margaret snorted, her needle stabbing the fabric. "Kind." Clara didn't know the meaning of the word. She'd criticize your stitching and your character in the same breath. Made Eliza cry more than once, didn't she? Eliza's hands shook, and she looked down, her lips moving in silent prayer. Laura glanced at her, then away, her voice low. "She pushed us to be better, but it wasn't always easy. She had high standards, and not everyone met them." Beatrice said nothing, her fingers brushing her locket, her face pale. Miss Marple noted the gesture, her mind returning to the churchyard, to Beatrice's fear and the cloaked figure in the lane. She decided to steer the conversation toward Clara's past, a subject that might loosen the threads of motive. "Clara was such a presence in the village," she said. "I suppose you all knew her for years. She must have had quite a history here." The room grew quieter, the needles slowing. Violet spoke first, her voice clipped. She'd been in St. Mary, Mead forever, same as most of us. Always thought she was above the rest, though, with her brother's connections and that inheritance. Margaret's eyes flashed. "Her brother," she said, the word dripping with venom. "Robert Henshaw was no saint, whatever Clara thought. Left a trail of broken promises, that one, and Clara never let me forget it." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly, her tone gentle. "Oh yes, Robert. I remember hearing about him. Quite a charmer, wasn't he? Caused a bit of a stir in his day. Eliza, unexpectedly, spoke up, her voice trembling but clear. He was Clara's pride, you know. She talked about him often, how he'd loved a soldier's life before he settled in London, but she mentioned once that he'd loved someone else, too, before he left. Someone who wasn't Margaret. Her eyes widened as if she'd said too much, and she ducked her head, her needle faltering. Margaret's face darkened, her lips a tight line. That's old history, she snapped, and Clara had no business dragging it up. She loved to rub salt in wounds, didn't she? Always knew just where to press. Laura shifted in her seat, her hands still. Clara talked about the past a lot, she said, her voice careful. She liked to remind us who we were, where we came from. It wasn't always kind. Beatrice's fingers tightened on her locket, her silence louder than words. Miss Marple watched her, her mind racing. Eliza's slip about Robert and a soldier suggested a connection to Beatrice, whose husband had been a soldier. Had Clara known something about Thomas Lane, something tied to Robert? She decided to probe, gently, like a needle through fabric. It's curious, isn't it, she said, how the past stays with us. I suppose Clara knew many secrets, being so close to you all. Mrs. Lane, you were often at her cottage, weren't you? Helping with patterns, I hear. Beatrice's head jerked up, her eyes wide with alarm. I took her things sometimes, she stammered. Patterns, thread. She asked me to, said I was reliable, but I didn't. I didn't know her secrets. Her voice cracked and she looked away, her fingers clutching the locket. Violet's eyes narrowed and she spoke before Miss Marple could respond. Clara collected secrets like she collected scissors, she said, her tone sharp. Always poking into people's business. It's a wonder she didn't get herself killed sooner. Mrs. Clements, hovering near the table, gasped. Violet. That's a terrible thing to say. Violet shrugged, unrepentant. It's true. Clara had a way of making enemies. If you ask me, whoever did it was settling a score. The room fell. Silent, the women's needles still. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene but her mind alight. Eliza's mention of Robert and a soldier, Margaret's bitterness. Beatrice's fear, these were threads weaving a new pattern. She recalled a village scandal, years ago, where a woman had killed to silence a rumor about her husband's infidelity. The motive had been love, twisted by betrayal, and Beatrice's locket, her visits to Clara, her presence in the churchyard, suggested a similar wound. She decided to press a little further, her voice soft but deliberate. It's sad, isn't it, how secrets can hurt. Clara's brother, Robert, did he know your husband, Mrs. Lane? Thomas, wasn't it? Such a brave man, from what I hear. Beatrice's face drained of colour, her hand dropping from the locket, as if it burned. They might have met, she whispered. In the war, perhaps. Clara mentioned it once, said Robert admired Thomas, but it was nothing, really. Her voice was too quick, her eyes avoiding Miss Marple's. Margaret smirked, her needle resuming its rhythm. Clara had a way of making nothing sound like something. She'd hint and prod until you felt like you were on trial. Isn't that right, Beatrice? Beatrice flinched, her stitches faltering, and Miss Marple noted the reaction, filing it away with the others. The conversation turned to safer topics, the bazaar, the weather, but Miss Marple's mind was busy. Robert Henshaw, a soldier, a charmer, perhaps linked to Thomas Lane. Had Clara known something about their past? Something she used to taunt Beatrice? The locket, the cloak, the scissors all pointed to a personal vendetta, a wound reopened by Clara's cruelty. As the meeting ended, Violet rose abruptly, citing a headache, and left with a curt nod. The others lingered, packing their sewing with slow, deliberate movements. Miss Marple helped gather stray threads, her eyes on Beatrice, who seemed reluctant to leave. When Mrs. Clements stepped out to fetch more tea, Miss Marple approached. Her tone gentle. "You must miss your husband terribly," she said. "It's hard, isn't it, when someone brings up old memories?" Beatrice nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "Clara, she didn't mean to be cruel, I think, but she knew things about Thomas, about the war. She'd say them like they were nothing, but they hurt." She stopped, her hand on her locket, and Miss Marple saw the pain in her eyes, raw and unguarded. "I'm sure she didn't mean to hurt you," Miss Marple said, though her mind was elsewhere. She recalled a village girl, long ago, who had killed. To protect her lover's name, her act born of a love that refused to let go. Beatrice's sorrow, her fear, her cloak, they were pieces of a pattern, and it was beginning to emerge. As she walked home through the quiet lanes, the village settling into noon, Miss Marple's thoughts were aloom, weaving the threads of the sewing circle. Violet's pride, Eliza's faith, Margaret's resentment, Laura's ambition, Beatrice's grief. 'Twas a possibility. But Beatrice's reaction to Robert's name, her locket, her presence in the lane, felt like the center of the design. Clara's scissors, chosen deliberately, suggested a killer who knew her intimately, who wanted her to feel the weight of her own pride. Miss Marple reached her cottage, the sun now high, and paused at the gate, her eyes on the hedgerows where a spider's web glistened with dew. The pattern was emerging, she thought, but it was not yet complete. She would need to speak to Inspector Craddock, to share her suspicions about Beatrice, and perhaps to revisit Rose Cottage, to see if the lane held more secrets. For in St. Mary Mead, the truth was like a quilt, its beauty in the stitches, its strength in the threads, and Miss Marple, with her patient, unerring eye, was determined to sew it together. Chapter 10. The final stitch. The late afternoon light filtered through the chintz curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting a soft glow across the sitting room where she sat, her knitting needles idle in her lap. The fire crackled in the grate, its warmth a counterpoint to the chill that had settled over St. Mary Mead since Clara Henshaw's murder. Outside, the village was hushed, its lanes empty save for the occasional rustle of leaves carried by the autumn breeze. Miss Marple's notebook lay open on the table, its pages a tapestry of names, motives, and observations, each entry a thread in the pattern she had been weaving since the sewing circle first caught her attention. Today, she felt, that pattern was nearly complete, its final stitch within reach. The encounter in the churchyard, Beatrice Lane's cloaked figure and trembling hands, had sharpened Miss Marple's suspicions. The locket, the rumors of a scandal, tied to Beatrice's husband, Clara's taunts about Robert Henshaw, these were not mere fragments, but a design, one that pointed to a motive rooted in grief and betrayal. Yet Miss Marple knew better than to trust intuition alone. The truth required evidence, and she had invited Inspector Craddock to tea, hoping to lay out her theory and prompt a final unraveling of the mystery. Craddock arrived promptly, his young face etched with the strain of a case that had eluded him. He settled into the armchair by the fire, accepting a cup of tea with a grateful nod. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "I've hit a wall. The sewing-circled ladies stick to their stories, and we've found nothing new at Rose Cottage. No fingerprints, no witnesses beyond old Gibbs and his cloaked figure. I'm beginning to think this one's beyond me." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes kind but sharp. "Nonsense, Inspector. You're closer than you think. It's like knitting a complicated pattern. Sometimes you don't see the shape until the last few rows. I've been thinking about Mrs. Lane, Beatrice. There's something there, I believe, that ties to Clara's death." Craddock's eyebrows rose, his interest piqued. "Beatrice, she's the quiet one. Always seemed the least likely. But you mentioned her visits to Rose Cottage. What's your theory?" Miss Marple set her teacup down, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "Let me tell you a story, Inspector, as I see it. Clara Henshaw was a woman who collected secrets, and she used them like needles, pricking those around her. Beatrice Lane, as you know, lost her husband, Thomas, in the war. She wears a locket with his hair, a symbol of her love and loss. But Clara, I think, knew something about Thomas, something tied to her brother, Robert, who was also a soldier. Perhaps a betrayal, a scandal, something that tarnished Thomas's memory. Clara, being Clara, used it to wound Beatrice, taunting her in private, perhaps even threatening to make it public." Craddock leaned forward, his notebook open. "Go on," he said. "What makes you think Beatrice acted on it?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, her voice steady. "Beatrice was seen often at Rose Cottage, delivering patterns, thread small errands, but frequent. Clara relied on her, trusted her, let her into her parlor where those scissors were kept. The night of the murder, Beatrice claims she stayed late at the vicarage, helping Mrs. Clemens. But Mrs. Clemens was vague about the time, and old Mr. Gibbs saw a cloaked figure leaving Rose Cottage at 10. I saw Beatrice myself, in a cloak, moving through the lane to the churchyard, her manner nervous, as if hiding something. I believe she followed Clara home that night, perhaps to confront her about those taunts. The door was unlocked. Clara was expecting no one, but Beatrice was familiar enough to enter unannounced. In a moment of rage or despair, she took the scissors from the case, a weapon that was Clara's pride, and struck. Craddock's brow furrowed. It fits, but it's all supposition. We need evidence. Beatrice's alibi is weak, but theirs. Nothing solid to tie her to the scene. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. Which is why I suggest you look at her home, Inspector. Not for blood or a cloak, those would be gone by now, but for something personal, something Clara might have given her. A letter, perhaps, or a note, something that shows Clara's hold over her. Beatrice's locket is precious to her, but Clara's taunts were not empty. She knew something, and she may have left a trace of it with Beatrice. Craddock scribbled. In his notebook, his face alight with purpose. A letter, thus worth checking. I'll get a warrant and search her cottage this afternoon. If there's anything there, I'll find it. But Miss Marple, why the scissors? Why not a knife or something else? Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. The scissors were Clara's, Inspector. They were her pride, displayed for all to see. To use them was to turn her own strength against her, a kind of justice in the killer's mind. Beatrice, I think, wanted Clara to feel the weight of her own cruelty. It's not so different from a village girl I once knew who broke her rival's best mirror to spite her. The act was small, but the intent was the same. Craddock rose, his hat in hand. You've given me a lot to work with, Miss Marple. If this pans out, I'll owe you more than tea. I'll let you know what we find." After he left, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her notebook open but untouched. She pictured Beatrice, her locket, her cloak, her quiet sorrow turned to rage. The pattern was clear now. The threads of motive and opportunity converging on a woman whose grief had been weaponized by Clara's cruelty. Yet Miss Marple felt no triumph, only a quiet sadness. Murder, she knew, was a human thing, born of pain as much as malice. That evening, Craddock returned, his face grim but triumphant. He carried a small evidence bag, inside which was a folded letter, its edges worn. "You were right, Miss Marple," he said, settling into the armchair. "We found this in Beatrice's cottage, hidden in a drawer with her sewing things. It's from Clara, dated a week before the murder. Listen to this. Beatrice, you know what Thomas did, and so do I keep my secrets, and I'll keep yours. But cross me, and the village will know your shame." It's not explicit, but it's enough. Clara was holding something over her, something about Thomas. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her voice was steady. Poor Beatrice, to live with that threat, that wound. Did she say anything? Craddock nodded, his expression heavy. "We confronted her, showed her the letter. She broke down, confessed everything. It was as you said. She followed Clara home that night, begged her to stop the taunts. Clara laughed, mocked Thomas's memory, said he'd been a coward, not a hero. Beatrice snapped, grabbed the scissors from the case, and struck. She didn't mean to kill her, she says, but the rage took over. She wore the cloak to hide, slipped out the back gate. Gibbs saw her, though she didn't know it." Miss Marple sighed, her hands folding in her lap. "A stitch in time, Inspector. But too late for Clara. Beatrice's love for Thomas was her strength, but Clara turned it into a weapon. It's a sad thing, how pain can twist us." Craddock shook his head, his voice low. "Sad or not, it's murder. She faced trial, though I doubt the jury will be harsh. Clara's cruelty didn't justify it, but it explains it." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the fire. She thought of Beatrice, her locket, her quiet visits to the churchyard, her life, shaped by a loss Clara had exploited. The pattern was complete, the final stitch in place, but it brought no joy. Murder, she knew, left no winners, only threads of sorrow woven into the fabric of the village. As Craddock left, promising to keep her informed, Miss Marple picked up her knitting, the needles clicking softly. The scarf for Raymond was nearly done, its cables a testament to patience and care. She thought of the sewing circle, its members bound by their craft, now torn apart by one desperate act. The truth had emerged, as it always did, but the cost was heavy, and Miss Marple, with her quiet, unerring eye, felt the weight of it as she stitched on into the night. Chapter 11. The circle unravelled. The autumn rain fell softly over St. Mary Mead, a gentle patter that cloaked the village in a sombre hush, as if mourning the fracture of its quiet routines. Miss Jane Marple sat in her sitting room, the fire casting a warm glow across the chintz curtains and polished furniture, her knitting needles still for once. The scarf for her nephew Raymond lay finished in her basket, its cables a testament to patience, much like the patience that had unravelled the mystery of Clara Henshaw's murder. Outside, the rain streaked the windows, blurring the world beyond, but within. Miss Marple's mind was clear, piecing together the aftermath of Beatrice Lane's confession. The village had been shaken by the news, whispered from cottage to shop to churchyard. Beatrice, the quiet widow with her silver locket and gentle ways, had confessed to Inspector Craddock, her words spilling like threads from a broken seam. She had killed Clara, driven by years of taunts about her husband Thomas, whose memory Clara had twisted with cruel hints of cowardice and betrayal. The letter found in Beatrice's cottage, Clara's thinly veiled threat to expose a scandal, had been the final stitch that snapped. Leading Beatrice to follow Clara home, seize her prized scissors, and strike in a moment of anguished rage. Miss Marple had learned the details from Craddock, who visited her that morning, his face a mixture of relief and regret. "It's done, Miss Marple," he had said, settling into her armchair with a cup of tea. "Beatrice told us everything, how Clara goaded her about Thomas, saying he'd shamed himself in the war, that he'd been no hero. Beatrice couldn't bear it, not after years of keeping his memory sacred. She didn't plan to kill her, she says, but when Clara laughed that night, something broke. She grabbed the scissors from the case, and well, you know the rest." Miss Marple had nodded, her eyes soft but steady. "Poor Beatrice," she murmured, "to carry such a wound, and to have it prodded so cruelly. Clara's scissors were her pride, but they became her undoing." Craddock had agreed, his voice low. "The jury will hear her story, and I suspect they'll be lenient. Clara's cruelty doesn't excuse murder, but it paints a picture. The village is in a state, though half pity Beatrice, half horrified. The sewing circle's finished, I hear. They can't bear to meet without her." Now, as the rain fell, Miss Marple reflected on the sewing circle, its members scattered, like threads from a torn quilt. She rose, crossing to the window, her hands clasped behind her back. The village green was empty, its grass slick with rain, and beyond it, the vicarage stood, its windows dark. The circle had been a cornerstone of St. Mary Mead, a place where women stitched not just fabric, but the fabric of their community. Yet Clara's death and Beatrice's act had unraveled it, exposing the resentments and secrets that had festered. Beneath the surface she thought of the others, each touched by the tragedy in their own way. Mrs. Violet Greaves, her pride wounded by Clara's flaunting of wealth, had retreated into her grand house, her debts no longer a secret but her dignity intact. Miss Eliza Trotter, her faith shaken by the violence, had taken to spending hours in the church, her prayer book a shield against the world's harshness. Mrs. Margaret Dunn, her bitterness softened by the shock, had grown quieter, her sharp tongue stilled by the realization that old grudges could lead to such ends. Miss Laura Finch, now heir to Clara's fortune, had left for London, her ambition untainted by suspicion but shadowed by the knowledge of what her mentor's death had cost. Miss Marple turned from the window, her gaze falling on her notebook, its pages now a record of a case closed. She had added a final entry after Craddock's visit. Beatrice's grief turned to rage, a secret weaponized. The locket, the cloak, the scissors all had pointed to Beatrice, but it was Clara's cruelty, her knack for finding and exploiting pain that had woven the fatal thread. Miss Marple recalled a village woman, long ago, who had poisoned a rival over a whispered scandal, her act born of a love too fierce to bear betrayal. Beatrice's crime was not so different, a desperate bid to protect a memory from further desecration. She sat again, her hands resting in her lap, and thought of the sewing circle's end. The vicarage would no longer echo with the click of needles or the murmur of voices. Its drawing room left a silence. Mrs. Clements had confided, tearfully, that the women could not face meeting again, their shared history tainted by blood. Yet Miss Marple knew that villagers, like people, healed in time. St. Mary Mead would find new ways to gather, new threads to weave its community together. A knock at the door startled her, and Lily entered, her apron damp from the rain. Mrs. Bantry's here," she said, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Says she needs to talk, something about the bazaar." Miss Marple nodded, rising to greet her friend. Mrs. Bantry bustled in, her coat dripping, her face a mixture of indignation and sorrow. "Jane, it's all too much," she said, sinking into a chair. "The bazaar's a shambles without the sewing circles, quilts, and the village is buzzing like a hive. Poor Beatrice, I never would have thought it, not in 100 years. And Clara, well, she wasn't a saint, but to die like that." Miss Marple poured tea, her movements calm. "It's a sad business, Dolly, but people carry burdens we don't see, and Clara had a way of finding them. Beatrice's love for her husband was her strength, but also her breaking point." Mrs. Bantry sighed, stirring her tea. "You saw it, didn't you? Before anyone else. How do you do it, Jane? You sit there with your knitting, and you see things. The rest of us miss." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "I only see what people are, Dolly, and people, like quilts, have patterns, flaws, and all. You just have to look closely." Mrs. Bantry stayed for an hour, her talk turning from murder to the mundane jam recipes, the vicar's latest sermon. But Miss Marple listened with half an ear, her mind on the sewing circle, its members now scattered. Violet would rebuild. Her pride, Eliza her faith, Margaret her peace, Laura her dreams. Beatrice, in time, would face her trial, and St. Mary Mead would watch, its judgment tempered by pity. As Mrs. Bantry left, the rain eased, leaving the village glistening under a tentative moon. Miss Marple returned to her chair, her notebook closed but her thoughts still weaving. The circle was unravelled, but its threads lingered, woven into the fabric of the village. She thought of Clara's scissors, sharp and gleaming, and Beatrice's locket, heavy with memory. The truth had been found, but its cost was a reminder that even in a place as quiet as St. Mary Mead, the human heart could be a dangerous thing. She picked up her knitting, the needles clicking softly, a new project already taking shape. The village would heal, she knew, its wounds stitched over time. But for now, she sat in the firelight, her eyes on the future, ready for the next pattern. To emerge from the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 12. The quiet of St. Mary Mead. The autumn had deepened over St. Mary Mead, its lanes now carpeted with fallen leaves that rustled underfoot like whispered secrets. The air carried a crisp bite, and the hedgerows, once vibrant with summers, green, stood bare, their branches etching stark patterns against the pale November sky. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, a shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm. The scarf for her nephew Raymond was long finished, gifted to him during his last visit, and now she worked on a pair of mittens for the church bazaar, her fingers deft despite the chill. The village was quiet, its surface calm, restored, but the echoes of Clara Henshaw's murder lingered, a faint tremor beneath the everyday. Miss Marple's cottage, with its rose-covered walls and polished windows, was a haven of order. Its sitting room a mirror of her mind, tidy, precise, yet alive, with the subtle patterns of human nature. The fire crackled in the grate, casting a warm glow across the chintz curtains and the photograph of Raymond on the mantelpiece. Her notebook, its pages filled with the threads of the sewing circle case, lay closed on the table, its work done. Beatrice Lane's confession had unraveled the mystery, revealing a motive woven from grief and betrayal. But the resolution brought Miss Marple no triumph, only a quiet reflection on the fragility of the human heart. The village had begun to heal, as villagers do, its rhythms resuming with the stubborn resilience of habit. The church bells rang for Sunday service, the postman cycled his rounds, and Mrs. Weatherby's shop buzzed with gossip, though now it turned to milder matters. The price of butter, the vicar's new hymnals, the upcoming bazaar. Yet the sewing circle, once a cornerstone of St. Mary Mead, was no more. Its members, scarred by Clara's death and Beatrice's act, had scattered, their needles silent, their quilts unfinished. Miss Marple, watching from her garden, felt the absence like a dropped stitch in the village's fabric. Inspector Craddock called that afternoon, his visit a courtesy as much as a necessity. He stood in her sitting room, hat in hand, his youthful face softened by gratitude. "Miss Marple," he said, settling into the armchair she offered, "I wanted to thank you again. Without your insight, we'd still be chasing shadows. Beatrice's trial is set for next month, and the solicitor thinks she'll get leniency. The jury will see Clara's cruelty for what it was, even if it doesn't excuse the act." Miss Marple poured tea, her movements steady. "You did the hard work, Inspector," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I only pointed out the pattern. Poor Beatrice's her love for her husband was her strength, but Clara turned it into a trap. It's a sad thing how a few words can unravel a life." Craddock nodded, sipping his tea. "Sad, indeed. The village is still reeling, you know. Mrs. Greaves has kept to herself, though she's paid off some debts sold a brooch, I hear. Miss Trotter's at the church every day, praying for forgiveness, though I'm not sure whose. Mrs. Dunn's quieter now, less sharp. And Miss Finch, well, she's off to London with Clara's money, but she didn't look happy when she left." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression was somber. "People carry their burdens, Inspector, even when they seem free. Laura's ambition will drive her, but she remember Clara's scissors. As for the others, they'll find their way. Villagers are like gardens, they grow back, given time." Craddock smiled, a touch of admiration in his gaze. "You see what we miss, Miss Marple. It's not just the clues, it's the people. How do you do it?" She set her cup down, her hands folding in her lap. "I only see what people are, Inspector. They're like stitches in a quilt, each one small, but together they make a whole. And when one stitch breaks, you see the pattern more clearly. Clara's death showed us the threads of St. Mary Mead, and Beatrice's act tied them together, however sadly." Craddock rose, his hat in hand. "Well, I hope the village stays quiet for a while. You've earned a rest, though I suspect you'll be knitting up another mystery before long." Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. "I shall keep my needles busy, Inspector, and my eyes open. St. Mary Mead is never as quiet as it seems." As he left, the rain began again, a soft drizzle that pattered against the windows. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the mittens taking shape under her fingers, their pattern simple but sure. She thought of the sewing circle, its members now dispersed, Violet rebuilding her pride, Eliza her faith, Margaret her peace, Laura her dreams, Beatrice her life, though in a cell. For now, the locket, the scissors, the cloaked figure, they were no longer clues but memories, woven into the village's story. She rose, crossing to the window, where the rain blurred the view of the lane. The church spire stood against the grey sky, a reminder of continuity, and beyond it, The vicarage, its drawing-room silent without the click of needles. Miss Marple thought of a village girl she had known years ago, who had mended a torn dress with such care that the seam was stronger than before. St. Mary Mead, she knew, would mend itself too, its wounds stitched by time and kindness. Yet she felt no complacency. Villagers, like people, held secrets, and St. Mary Mead was no exception. The quiet was a surface, beneath which currents flowed love, envy, grief, ambition. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, the mittens growing stitch by stitch. She would tend her garden, knit her gifts, listen to Lily's gossip, and watch the village with her quiet, unerring eye. For in St. Mary Mead, peace was fleeting, and the next puzzle, she knew, was never far away. The end.